Ilhan Omar burned her own political empire to the ground in 11 seconds of dead silence. She did not fall to a rival faction. She did not lose to a coordinated media hit. She dismantled her own armor on live television. 14 broadcast cameras were rolling. 6,200,000 people were watching, and she could not find a single word. For 7 years, this representative survived every political storm and every ethics probe using one flawless tactic. When backed into a corner, she would pivot, stare down the interrogator, and weaponize her identity. She routinely used the Somali diaspora as a human barricade. She would point to the cameras and declare her critics were attacking marginalized immigrants. That formula worked every time. It silenced the room for nearly a decade her armor held up. Then Senator Tim Scott turned on his microphone. The ground shifted. You cannot run a racial grievance playbook against Tim Scott. His grandfather picked cotton in South Carolina. His mother ground through 16-hour shifts on a factory floor just to pay rent. He sits as the only black Republican in the United States Senate. He arrived at that oversight table with one specific question the Congresswoman was unequipped to handle. She froze, not because the question was complex. She froze because the man asking it rendered her standard defensive playbook useless. He wanted to know how $250 million vanished from a federal program designed to feed starving Somali children. These were impoverished kids living in her own district. The money flowed through a legislative loophole she authored. It funneled through a local restaurant she actively promoted on television. Federal prosecutors later confirmed this specific establishment never prepared a single plate of food for a child in need. Sitting across from her, Scott did not yell. He spoke with the slow, mournful rhythm of a Southern pastor delivering tragic news. He asked her directly who was supposed to protect her own community from her. 11 seconds of dead air followed. No rehearsed cries of prejudice, no accusations of bias. For the first time in 7 years, she had nothing to say. She orchestrated her own ruin by failing to answer the exact question her own constituents had been waiting to ask. During the first 9 minutes of that proceeding, the Congresswoman owned the room. In a rare move for a witness, she stood up to deliver her opening testimony. It projected calculated defiance. For 5 uninterrupted minutes, she painted a cinematic portrait of her journey as a refugee. She spoke of Mogadishu, the echo of gunfire, surviving 4 years in a Kenyan transit camp and arriving in America as a 2-year-old who spoke no English. 7 separate times, she verbally claimed ownership of her community 4 times. She invoked the imagery of helpless children. She leveraged the struggles of the working-class Somali mothers in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. She detailed how they pulled double shifts and still stared at empty kitchen cabinets when local schools shut down in 2020. Having set the stage, she turned to the panel with a practiced tilt of her chin. She declared the hearing a sham. She labeled the inquiry a targeted harassment campaign designed to flood the streets of Minneapolis with federal agents. The gallery behind her was a curated sea of support. Buses had carried loyalists in from Cedar Riverside. They were ready to applaud on cue. Out in the corridor, her legislative aide let out a sigh of relief. The political theater was operating flawlessly. The Congresswoman had rehearsed this exact routine for 3 days. The strategy was basic. Transform a dry financial hearing into a grand narrative of religious persecution. Generate an emotional soundbite. Let the internet handle the rest. Senator Ted Cruz was allotted the next 15 minutes. He was the precise adversary her team had prepared for. The conservative from Texas represented the ideal foil. His mere presence would instantly validate her carefully constructed framework of victimhood. A heavy binder sat on her desk. It contained 40 pages of rehearsed counter-arguments tailored to combat his rhythm. But Cruz leaned toward his microphone and officially yielded his remaining time to the senator from South Carolina. Out in the hallway, her aide stopped breathing. On the broadcast monitor, Tim Scott quietly organized his documents. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a man setting a dining table. Frantically, the aide typed a warning to the legal counsel inside the chamber. Scott was taking over. No further explanation was required. Every defensive pivot in that binder operated on the assumption the interrogator would be a white conservative. Tim Scott did not fit that profile. Looking up from his paperwork, Scott began to speak. His voice carried the sincere, flat cadence of the rural interior. It was the tone of small Baptist congregations and public school cafeterias. He opened by looking at the representative and validating her history. He acknowledged her survival through refugee camps. He respectfully stated nobody in that room could imagine her struggle. He paused. A distinct shift occurred in his posture. His shoulders squared. His chin dropped. He underwent the physical realignment of a man who has finished being polite and is now prepared to focus on cold facts. He firmly stated that while he respected her journey, he was not there to listen to that story for the 500th time. He was there to locate $250 million in missing federal funds, money meant to feed hungry Somali children, black children living inside her own district, children left to starve because of a legislative loophole she had written into law. Sitting beside the Congresswoman, her legal counsel placed a firm hand on her arm. It was the instinctive grip of a defense attorney realizing his client had wandered into an ambush he could not navigate. Scott did not lean aggressively over the desk. Instead, he deployed the driest category of legislative inquiry. He asked questions rooted entirely in structural facts. You cannot deflect those questions with emotional grandstanding. Personal feelings hold zero jurisdiction over federal statutes. He brought up the Meals Act. He noted she introduced the legislation in 2020. He detailed how the law expanded eligibility requirements for federal child nutrition funds. It allowed organizations outside the public school system to claim massive government payouts. Keeping her tone level, the Congresswoman confirmed the details. She defended the act as an emergency pandemic response. She cited starving kids and closed cafeterias. Scott pressed forward. He focused strictly on the mechanics of the bill bearing her name. He asked a simple question. Did she bother to include any mandatory audit requirements, verification mechanisms, or routine site inspection protocols when she drafted the legislation? Her right hand instinctively drifted toward the edge of her binder, but nothing in those 40 pages of rehearsed retorts could save her. She was trapped by a structural reality concerning her own legislative craftsmanship. No amount of rhetorical spin can alter the text of a law you wrote yourself. Without waiting for a defense, Scott laid out the consequences. Under the expanded provisions she created, 300 independent food distribution sites registered for federal funding. Law enforcement officials later confirmed the vast majority of those sites never cooked a meal. They never fed a single human being. $250 million drained from the Treasury to pay for ghost meals that starving children never saw. Turning his gaze away from the witness, Scott looked directly into the camera lens. He spoke directly to the citizens watching from home. He introduced a woman named Fadumo Hassan. She resides in Cedar Riverside, a neighborhood frequently called Little Mogadishu. She is a mother raising 3 children. To keep her family afloat, she scrubs rooms at a downtown hotel while her husband drives a ride-share vehicle. Their combined annual household income is $29,000. During the height of the lockdowns, this mother registered her children for the exact federal feeding program the Congresswoman had championed. 3 separate times, she walked her kids through the freezing cold to the distribution site. 3 separate times, she was turned away and told the food was gone. The humiliation eventually took its toll. She stopped showing up. She stayed in her cramped apartment. She boiled plain rice purchased with money she desperately needed for rent. Yet, federal ledgers show $250 million was successfully claimed under the guise of feeding kids exactly like hers. Her one-year-old daughter never received a single crumb. Inside the hearing room, the gallery went completely dead. This was not the choreographed silence of an organized protest. It was the suffocating quiet of a room full of people hearing a story they knew was entirely factual. They had lived through the exact same reality. Opening a new file on his laptop, Scott brought the large display monitors inside the chamber to life. He announced he was going to play a piece of video evidence lasting 38 seconds. It featured the representative appearing on a regional Somali language television broadcast in 2020. The audio was familiar and intimate. It captured a politician speaking directly to her own people in their native tongue. English translations scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Scott read the subtitles aloud. He paced his delivery like a judge reading a final verdict. In the video, she expressed gratitude toward a local establishment named Safari. She praised them for preparing 2,300 meals every single day to local families facing starvation. Scott let the translated words hang in the air. Then he delivered the cold truth. Law enforcement conclusively identified that exact Safari restaurant as the central hub of the largest fraud network in the entire operation. The owner of the establishment and the co-conspirators had all been convicted in federal court. Detectives proved Safari never served 2,300 meals a day. They served zero. The millions of dollars in federal reimbursements meant to keep those children alive were instead funneled directly into imported vehicles. They went into commercial real estate portfolios. They vanished into untraceable overseas wire transfers. Scott looked at the Congresswoman and stated the undeniable reality. She had gone on television. She had spoken to her community in their own language. She had promised Safari was feeding their hungry children. In reality, Safari was feeding no one. Desperate to regain control, the Congresswoman leaned into her microphone. She deployed the only tactic she had left. She firmly declared the senator's line of questioning was a broader administrative campaign designed to maliciously target the Somali community. She cited the presence of federal agents in Minneapolis. Scott did not interrupt her monologue. He sat back and waited patiently for her to finish. When the room settled, he delivered a sentence that would be clipped and shared 31 million times over the next 3 days. He reminded her $250 million was not stolen from random taxpayers in the Midwest. It was siphoned directly from Somali children living in her own neighborhood who went to bed starving. He sternly commanded her to stop calling his investigation an attack on her community. The real attack on her community was the financial theft executed under the banner of charity. That theft was made entirely possible by the legislative door she had personally opened. Behind her, the gallery remained entirely motionless. For the first time since the gavel dropped, the supporters wearing campaign buttons sat perfectly still. Disagreeing with the senators, logic required them to publicly disagree with the basic premise that starving Somali children deserve to eat. Nobody sitting in those chairs could possibly argue against that. Her defensive armor did not dramatically shatter in that moment. It just became painfully irrelevant. The senator's voice underwent another distinct transformation. The pastoral empathy vanished. It was replaced by the meticulous tone of a forensic accountant discovering a glaring discrepancy on a balance sheet. He announced he wanted to discuss 3 specific numbers. Instantly, 3 official federal documents appeared side by side on the overhead monitors. The first was her 2023 financial disclosure form. It listed her husband's total business assets at $51,000. The second was the exact same disclosure filed a year later. It showed those identical assets inexplicably ballooning to somewhere between $6 million and $30 million. The third document was a hasty amendment filed shortly after. It slashed the total net worth back down to under $100,000. He let the 3 forms sit on the screens in silence. The visual evidence was devastating. It required no additional commentary. Here were 3 official government documents. all signed under penalty of perjury, all telling three conflicting stories about the exact same pool of money. Scott noted her office had previously dismissed this discrepancy as a simple accounting error. He leaned forward. A $30 million swing on a sworn federal document is not a clerical mistake. He presented her with a binary trap. Did she even bother to read the legal forms before signing her name? Following a frantic whisper from her attorney, she offered a canned response. She stated she relied entirely on professional accounting guidance. Scott countered by bringing up her husband's venture capital firm. The company publicly claimed to manage $60 billion in assets, yet it lacked basic registration with federal securities regulators. It operated out of a shared desk space. He asked if she was aware of these facts. She refused to answer. Turning his attention back to the broadcast cameras, Scott circled back to the hotel housekeeper. He reminded the public Fadumo Hassan earns $29,000 a year. The mathematical difference between the Congresswoman's initial filing and her eventual correction was nearly $30 million. Scott did the math out loud. That discrepancy equals 1,031 years of the housekeeper's total salary. He looked back at the witness desk. That number is not an accounting error. It is pure financial fiction. Down at the witness table, the representative grabbed a pen. She scratched out a single line of text on her legal pad. The erratic physical gesture of writing in her native language and then furiously crossing it out betrayed deep internal panic. It was the reaction of a person retreating to their safest sanctuary only to find it compromised. Pacing his delivery like a deliberate drumbeat, Scott began reading a chronological timeline of her evasions. The State Fraud Prevention Committee had invited her to testify. She declined. Investigators requested her private communications with the primary suspect. She ignored them. A subpoena for her records was blocked by a partisan committee vote. She physically turned her back and walked away when a journalist asked if she would cooperate with law enforcement. Congressional oversight panels asked for her husband's financial ledgers. They received absolute silence. Yet despite her refusal to speak, her name surfaced 6 separate times in the federal court exhibits during the prosecution of the fraud ring leaders. He listed an email chain containing her private address. He cited text messages recovered during a search warrant execution. He read the subject line of an internal memo explicitly naming her office. The employee referenced in those documents had recently fled the country, only to be apprehended by international authorities in Mogadishu. Setting his papers down, Scott folded his hands together. He spoke directly to the Congresswoman. He explained he had seen innocent people falsely accused of terrible things. Innocent people always rush to clear their names. They voluntarily bring documents. They demand the opportunity to speak. They do not hide. She refused to show up when her home state asked. She produced nothing when federal oversight demanded answers. She remained entirely silent regarding the court exhibits bearing her name. He looked her in the eye. That pattern of behavior has a very specific name. Then came the 11 seconds of silence. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. 3 different broadcast networks captured the exact sequence of her paralysis from 3 different angles. It was a moment of political system failure that 6,200,000 people watched live. 47 million more would scrutinize it over the following week. Out in the hallway, her legislative aide placed her mobile phone face down on her knee. She stared at a screen glowing with unanswered text messages from the campaign's crisis management firm. They demanded to know who approved the Safari restaurant video. They begged for the production records immediately. Relying on survival instincts, the representative attempted to claw her way out of the corner. She fought back. The refugee who survived the horrors of Mogadishu simply does not know how to surrender. Gripping the microphone, she declared she had spent her entire existence fighting for her people. Her voice fractured under the strain. It cracked from the deep wound of a person who believes their own mythology so completely that having it challenged feels like a physical blow. She recounted fleeing war zones and rotting in camps. She aggressively reminded the room she arrived in America with nothing. She had dedicated her public life to ensuring marginalized immigrants were not utilized as cheap political props in partisan hearings. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery behind her. It was the hesitant sound of loyalists who wanted to applaud but suddenly lacked the certainty their applause would land with the same moral authority it held an hour earlier. Scott listened without moving a muscle. He waited with the unbothered patience of a man who knows the sky will eventually run out of rain. When the room went quiet, he acknowledged her genuine love for her roots. But he surgically exposed her fatal blind spot. Every single time someone dares to ask a legitimate question about $250 million missing dollars, she shoves the Somali community into the line of fire. She claims prejudice. She uses the names of impoverished children who never received a meal as a human barricade. A shield does not protect the vulnerable people standing in front of it. A shield only protects the politician cowering behind it. He laid out the grim reality of her tactics. $250 million were diverted under the guise of feeding her people. Nearly 90% of the indicted criminals shared her heritage. Her own neighborhood now carried the suffocating stigma of a national fraud scandal. Federal immigration enforcement vehicles were patrolling the streets of Minneapolis entirely because of this disaster. Yet she, the powerful leader, claiming to be their protector, refused to answer a single procedural question to help clear their names. The room experienced a collective revelation. The recognition swept through the gallery like a shockwave. It passed through the crowd like a congregation when the pastor names the specific sin everyone knew existed but was too terrified to vocalize. Scott delivered the fatal blow. She did not protect her community. She used her community to protect herself. Every time she screamed Islamophobia to dodge financial accountability, she made it infinitely harder for anyone else to genuinely protect marginalized people from actual discrimination. When the committee chairman formally asked if the representative wished to issue a response, she leaned forward to speak, but the voice echoing through the chamber was no longer the roaring voice of the populist champion. It was the cautious, sterilized voice of a cornered attorney. She had been stripped of the rhetorical music that originally made her famous. She read off a prepared statement. She claimed she fully cooperated with all legitimate inquiries. She noted the president signed the Meals Act into law. She formally rejected the basic premise of the interrogation. Her sentences were technically structured. But following 11 seconds of televised paralysis, reading boilerplate defensive language is the rhetorical equivalent of locking the front door from the inside while the entire roof caves in. Every person sitting in that chamber could hear the glaring difference between the passionate leader who had spoken about her homeland with tears in her eyes and the defeated bureaucrat desperately reading legal jargon. Scott delivered one final sentence before ending his time. He reminded her one last time about Fadumo Hassan, the mother who walked her kids through the freezing snow 3 times only to be turned away. The mother who boiled plain rice with money she needed to keep a roof over her family's head. He looked at the congresswoman. The housekeeper never needed a political shield. She just needed a plate of food. He closed his laptop. He squared his paperwork. He placed his pen down on the desk with quiet finality. There was nothing left to say. Out in the corridor, her legislative aide remained slumped on a wooden bench. Her phone rested face down on her lap. She was staring at the floor, thinking deeply about her own mother, a woman who also lived in Cedar Riverside. She filled out the registration paperwork for the feeding program, only to receive nothing in return. For 2 years, the aide never dared to ask her boss about the missing food. Asking that question meant stepping out from behind the protective political barricade. It meant admitting the horrific question Senator Scott had just asked was the exact same question she had been carrying around in her own chest. The aftermath was brutal and swift. It was defined by two specific video clips acting as devastating political maneuvers. The first piece of footage highlighted the senator accusing her of using her own people as a shield. It culminated in her 11 seconds of total paralysis. That specific clip amassed 31 million views in 3 days. The hashtag regarding the shield dominated social media trends. What made this moment uniquely destructive was its universal circulation. It was not just conservative news networks running the footage on a loop. It was actively shared by accounts embedded within the Somali diaspora. These community members simply posted the raw 1-second clip without any caption at all. The silence spoke louder than any written text ever could. The second video was the footage of the Congresswoman speaking on regional television. She was enthusiastically praising the safari restaurant investigators proved was entirely fraudulent. The clip superimposed the English translation over her native words. It was followed by Scott reading the criminal verdict. That video pulled in 18 million views. It bypassed standard political echo chambers. It penetrated deep into encrypted messaging groups utilized by immigrants across Minneapolis and stretching to East Africa. The video played in the exact language she used to build her empire. When a betrayal is broadcast in your mother tongue, it ceases to be a distant political scandal. It becomes profoundly unforgivable. During the first week of the fallout, her office released a 9-sentence public statement. It was 3 sentences longer than her usual press releases, a clear metric of internal panic. She doubled down on the persecution narrative. She completely ignored the missing $250 million. She ignored the safari restaurant video. She ignored the fluctuating financial disclosures. She ignored her name appearing in 6 separate federal court exhibits. It was a blanket denial completely devoid of factual receipts. It effectively handed her opponents a map showing exactly where her darkest secrets were buried. By the end of that week, the editorial board of her largest local newspaper published a short paragraph landing with the weight of a judicial ruling. This publication had fiercely endorsed her through 3 consecutive election cycles. They noted Senator Scott simply asked the question the entire state of Minnesota had been too terrified to ask for 3 years. The board stated her blatant refusal to answer suggested the public's fear of the truth was entirely justified. They firmly demanded she stop hiding and cooperate with all active investigations. They concluded the Somali community deserved factual answers, not political shields. By the second week, a coalition of Somali business owners operating in Minneapolis issued a joint public statement. It was formatted as a desperate plea. They publicly begged their representative to fully cooperate with federal investigators in order to clear the neighborhood's reputation. They stated clearly her continued silence was being weaponized as evidence of collective guilt. The working class could no longer afford to carry the burden of her secrecy. The document held 43 signatures from local restaurant owners, taxi dispatchers, and daycare directors. It carried the crushing weight of an entire demographic pivoting away from their champion. They turned toward the broadcast cameras and effectively stated they refused to be utilized as a human barricade any longer. Simultaneously, the Department of Justice aggressively expanded its financial probe. They issued subpoenas targeting the business ledgers of her inner circle. The federal inquiries regarding her sudden wealth accumulation and the massive child nutrition fraud were no longer separate issues. They were converging like 2 rivers, rushing toward the exact same waterfall. Moving into week 3, a prominent local labor leader and primary challenger launched her first broadcast advertisement. It was a 3-0-second spot devoid of any dramatic voiceover. It simply played the footage of Scott asking about the missing audit requirements. It was followed by the agonizing silence. It ended with stark white text demanding answers and better leadership. The campaign ran the ad heavily on local Somali language radio stations. It marked the very first time a political rival bypassed the English-speaking press to speak directly to the immigrant community in their own dialect. They explicitly pointed out their leader was hiding the truth. The internal polling numbers immediately triggered warning sirens. The incumbent's support plummeted to 51%. The challenger surged to 28%. A massive block of voters moved to undecided. In a heavily leaning progressive district where she had comfortably cruised to victory with 74% of the vote just 18 months prior, barely holding a majority was a statistical death spiral. As the second month dragged on, federal judges began unsealing the court exhibits. Internal emails clearly demonstrated her office actively providing enrollment guidance to the very entities orchestrating the fraud. Her communications team scrambled to frame the emails as standard constituent services. That defense was technically accurate, but contextually, it was equivalent to a locksmith defending himself by claiming he happily cuts duplicate keys for the burglars actively robbing the neighborhood. The Congressional Ethics Committee formally opened an investigation into her erratic wealth disclosures. Her legal team immediately released a statement promising full cooperation. The sudden deployment of the word cooperate was a massive concession. Stripped entirely of her usual aggressive prefixes regarding partisan witch hunts, it signaled the defensive barricades were being quietly dismantled. By the third month, her massive social media following remained numerically stable. But the internal ecosystem mutated. Her comment sections, once flooded with English praise and declarations of loyalty, shifted entirely. They were now filled with Somali text demanding she answer the allegations. Her own people, using her own language, were aggressively asking the exact same question the conservative senator had asked, not because a Republican had instructed them to do so, because the hearing had finally given them the social permission to vocalize the deep betrayal they had harbored in secret. Her political armor had repelled outside criticism for nearly a decade. But it was completely powerless to stop a rebellion orchestrated by the very people the armor was constructed from. 30 days after the gavel fell in Washington, the temperature in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis plummeted to 15 degrees below zero. Fadumo Hassan was walking home from an after-school program. She gripped her young daughter's hand against the bitter wind. As they approached the intersection of Riverside and Cedar, the stark blue lights of a federal immigration checkpoint pulsed rhythmically against the fresh snow. 2 enforcement vehicles and 4 armed agents stood idle in the cold. It was a permanent neighborhood fixture ever since the federal indictments decimated the community's reputation. Squeezing her mother's hand tighter, the 1-year-old girl looked at the armed men. She asked in her native tongue who the authorities were hunting. The mother quietly reassured her daughter they were not looking for them. But deep down, Fadumo knew exactly why those flashing blue lights were stationed on her corner. They were parked in her neighborhood because of the stolen $250 million. Because a powerful politician wrote a sweeping federal law, went on television to praise a fake restaurant, and then stood in front of 14 cameras and refused to utter a single word of defense when the corrupt system collapsed on top of her constituents. Back inside the cramped warmth of their apartment, a pot of rice simmered on the stove. The young girl worked on her homework. The evening news was playing in the background. It aired the viral clip of the senator's interrogation for the 5th time that day. Hearing the audio, the young girl looked up from her books. She recognized the woman on the screen wearing the hijab. She asked her mother what the woman actually did for a living. Fadumo slowly reached for the remote control. She muted the television volume. She glanced out the frost-covered window at the blue emergency lights still pulsing at the end of their street. She plainly stated the woman on the screen wrote a federal law designed to feed starving children. She paused. She let the reality fill the small kitchen. Then she reminded her daughter that despite that law, they never received a single meal. The young girl did not ask any follow-up questions. 11 years old is old enough to fully comprehend the hypocritical distance between a politician writing a law in Washington and a child actually receiving a plate of food in Minnesota. The girl quietly returned to her schoolwork. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, Fadumo stared at the original Federal Nutrition Program registration form from 2020. It was still pinned to the front of their refrigerator by a small magnet. She slowly reached out, pulled the useless document down, folded it in half, and dropped it into the trash can. Outside the window, the federal lights continued to flash against the freezing snow. In the heart of Cedar Riverside, the protective shield their chosen representative had built was permanently broken. It did not break inside a sterile committee room in the Capitol. It broke at a freezing intersection at 8 at night when a young girl had to walk past armed federal agents and ask her mother who they were hunting. The answer was not them. But the tragic reality was the agents were there strictly because of them. Because of a loophole written in their name, millions of dollars diverted in their name, and an agonizing 1-second silence kept entirely in their name. The true distance between the powerful woman who wrote the legislation and the hungry girl who never received the food was measured by the unforgiving chasm between a political shield and the vulnerable people it was supposed to protect. And that distance, after 7 long years of blind loyalty, had finally grown too massive to ignore.